the International Peace Foundation is bringing into the country a number of Nobel Peace Prize laureates from different fields in an event called Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. The series of talks will be held in both here and in Thailand rather. Professor Finn Erling Kydland, a 2004 Nobel laureate for economics, is now discussing peace and economic development in the age of globalization at the Ateneo de Manila University. Let's listen in.
I'm on this trip, so you can also thank her for us being here. It's with a certain amount of trepidation that I include the word peace in a title, because I'm not really a researcher on peace. What are my qualifications? At the same time, I have been fortunate enough to be involved in events in the past 3 years dealing with thinking about peace and, it turns out, economic development. I was invited in the spring of 2005 for the first time to a conference arranged by Elie Wiesel, jointly with King of Jordan, to take place in Petra, Jordan. And we have been there again the following 2 years, and the 4th annual conference will take place in June of this year. At this conference, primarily for Nobel laureates, but other experts such as higher government officials and otherwise, we're divided into 4 groups. By the way, a typical title of this conference is either Saving the World, or last year it was called Building a Better World. At this conference, we have been divided into 4 groups, and I've always been in the group on economic development. And so it seems clear that Elie Wiesel considers economic development an important prerequisite for conditions of peace. And I agree entirely with that. Everything I've learned, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, have convinced me of that. In addition to that, having been at those conferences, I suppose the only other qualification I could point to is I'm a Norwegian. And Norwegians are known to travel over the world and try to broker peace. They have been to several places in the world as negotiators. And of course, when Alfred Nobel decided to make peace one of his prizes, he didn't trust the Swedes to hand them out. That duty is given to the Norwegians. So let me start with some motivating charts. It seems like kind of an idiosyncratic collection of countries. We have real GDP per capita for a number of countries. The top one is a natural benchmark, the United States, a few other countries, covering the period from 1950 to about 2005. It's a tough problem to make GDP per capita comparable across countries with different currencies or different purchasing power of the currencies. These numbers are taken from the so-called World Pen Tables from an organization that has done their best to make the numbers comparable across countries. There's always debate about how comparable they are, but for my purpose, it doesn't really matter. For my purpose, it's the big differences across some of these tables or some of these numbers that are illustrative. And you'll see, for example, Well, I have put the Philippines in among these tables. The Philippines, I don't know if everyone can see this dot. Can you see the dot in the back? Otherwise, no point in using it. But here's the Philippines. Not much up and down in that picture, so it doesn't seem like the business cycles have been so pronounced. There was a bigger fluctuation in the country from which we just came, Thailand, where there was a big drop in the after 1997. The thing to say about the Philippines, I suppose, is one would wish this curve to be steeper. Now, and that's exactly the type of thing I'll be talking about here. What are the factors that could make to make these curves at least somewhat steeper and maybe not so much up and down in the curves? One country you may make a note of is this teal-colored curve. That's Argentina, and I'll get back to that country later. Argentina started off not being so far behind the major countries in the world. If I'd gone back 100 years or 120 years, Argentina would have been up there among the top 5 or 6 countries. And so one reason I'm going to talk a little more about Argentina, as was mentioned in the introduction, I think one can learn a lot from observing the policies that have been carried out in countries that have done poorly, such as, unfortunately, Argentina. And I will also use as an example a country that has done spectacularly in the past 20 years. So we may take a note of that curve. Here's a plot on the same scale. Notice that in both of these first plots, the income per capita goes on a scale from 0 to 40,000. Here we see what has happened, for example, to Ireland. So among these countries, they move up and down, up more or less together. There are a couple of relative laggards, but still these are doing pretty well, namely Greece and Spain, and they have picked up speed in the past 10 or 15 years. Ireland used to be down there with Greece and Spain until about 1990. Notice how Ireland has taken off in the past 20 years. Just a spectacular growth. So much so that it's sometimes referred to as the Celtic Tiger. Now, notice again that we're talking about a scale of $0 to $40,000 in these two first plots. In the next plot, unfortunately, we look at a more depressing picture. In the next plot, the scale is going to go from 0 to 3,000. In other words, none of the countries will get above this level, to which I'm pointing here. 3,000 is about there. And these are a collection of countries from Africa. I could have taken other nations as well in the world, but these are examples of countries. Not only do they have low per capita income and persistently so, but they are countries in which at various times there have been conflicts. There have been episodes that are about as far from peace as can be. The country among these, the best performing countries are Cameroon and Lesotho. Lesotho is, well, it sits there. It's a tiny country, sits there in the middle of South Africa, and that's a country in which for most of these countries, if I had made the picture in real income per capita, the curves would have looked almost identical. For the United States, real income is about the same as real GDP per capita. For Lesotho, they're actually doing better than this picture shows, because income, it's one of the textbook examples of where the difference between GDP and income can be pretty high. And the reason is that many inhabitants of Lesotho, they work in South Africa, they cross the border, and then they bring home their salaries. So the income is higher than what's being produced within their borders. So Lesotho does reasonably well. But you see several countries that are doing very poorly. There's Liberia, the dark blue. There's Burundi, Congo, the two Congos. I have Chad in this picture. Chad is a country that ran into trouble only this past week. And who knows what this picture will look like in 5 or 10 years if they cannot solve those problems. So I'll use these pictures as motivations, as suggestive that there is a connection between peace and economic development. And now I'll talk in more detail about this very wide topic. And because it's such a wide topic, in 45 minutes I cannot really cover such a broad aspect of it. I'll choose to talk about issues that are fairly close to my research. I get nervous if I have to go too far beyond what I have researched myself, and so that's part of the choice of the selection of topic. A quick overview of the talk is I'll give it will be somewhat essential to give you a sense of what the framework for modern macroeconomics is. I'll talk about something that I think it was touched upon in the introduction, and I'll talk about this issue of rules versus discretion. It's an issue from one of the two papers cited by the Nobel Committee. And what I'll try to do is give you a sense of the fundamental reason for this issue, for the resulting potential policy inconsistency over time. I'll give you a few acute examples, and then I'll give you the lessons I have promised from Argentina and Ireland, and finally I'll make some general comments, some general remarks about the factors that either foster or hamper economic development. This framework, I suppose that was one of the things cited by the Nobel Committee. Prescott and I coming up with this way of modeling the macroeconomy. It's in big contrast to the types of models that used to exist in the 60s and the 70s. What Prescott and I did was we put people into the models. We made an explicit description of the decision problems facing people, and these decision problems are very dynamic. They are forward-looking. Many of the most important decisions in facing people, they are forward-looking. The contrast with the previous framework was, of course, all macroeconomic models try to summarize what people do in the aggregate, but the previous framework did it in the form of many equations. For example, a consumption equation, an investment demand equation. Consumption equation, I'm simplifying a little bit, but it might be something that said if your income goes up by $1,000, your consumption goes up by $900. Well, if you think about the economics of such a problem, it's clear that you cannot make such a blanket statement. It's got to make a big difference if that income, the increase in income as being proposed in the so-called rescue package for the United States, now associated with the decline in activity associated with the so-called subprime mortgage crisis. That rescue package is, it's emphasized, is supposed to be temporary. In other words, a temporary reduction in taxes that will result in additional income. I would predict that the increase in consumption spending resulting from that will be no more than about 10%. If it had been a permanent increase, then most likely about 100% of it would be spent. And so that's, with a temporary increase, most of it will be saved. That's an example of the importance of the forward-lookingness of modern macroeconomics. So people are characterized by their preferences over goods, goods and services, let's say, and leisure into the indefinite future. They are constrained in their behavior by their budget constraints. From the point of view of the economy as a whole, it's constrained by their resources. Another important resource taken into account in these models is time, a very important resource, as I'm sure you all understand. We also need a description of the business sector, because the business sector, in some sense, provides a description of the capacity of the economy at every point in time to produce stuff, to produce the consumption goods, to produce the so-called investment goods that will result in the future capacity to be augmented. And we often do that in the form of what we call the aggregate production function. It describes the nation's technology for converting the two major inputs, capital in the form of factories, machines, office buildings, and so on the one hand, and labor input, the hours of work by all the workers in the economy, into goods and services, into consumption goods, into investment goods, and so on. Now, the economy, typical economies have become better at doing this over time. And this ability to do so more efficiently over time, to think of or to invent better production processes, maybe to produce more efficient machines, to produce better goods, that ability we can call technological change. And that's such an important factor. It's such an important factor for the development of economies. As you can see, I put that in boldface letters. And I do think a little more broadly about technological change than what the words might say. It's not just research and development, innovation, and so on, especially at the business cycle frequency. Many things that happen in the economy could be as if there was a shock or a change in the technology, change in the ability to convert capital and labor into goods and services. The old shock, it turns out, was as behaved or resulted in had the effect on the ability to produce as if it had been a negative shock to the technology level. There could be changes in the nature of contracting between businesses and workers. There could be a change in the provision of infrastructure. Changes in regulations could play a role. I would always, especially in Latin America, use the example of banking panics. Banking panics have occurred from time to time. They occurred in the United States in the Great Depression in the early 30s. They have occurred in Argentina and other Latin American countries. And when they occur, usually they have a negative effect on the banking system, on the financial, the ability to financially intermediate, as we say in economic language, intermediate between the savers, often millions of people saving small amounts, and the investors who put these sums of small amounts into big factories and machines and so on. Very important function, and if their behavior is affected, for example, through a banking panic, or now the subprime mortgage crisis, it will be as if you throw sand into an otherwise well-functioning machine, and it will be as if there's a technological negative shock. These models I use primarily to ask quantitative questions. I think of them as a measuring device, and I think they have answered many, many interesting questions over time. Computational ability, power has made it possible to ask a wider set of questions that requires that you introduce a lot of detail about household behavior over the business cycle, or even these days, family behavior is all the rage in the research. It turns out there are many questions one can ask whose answers hinge on interactions or what generally is called family behavior. Now, of course, central to this talk is going to be the role of the government. And the government can be introduced as a third player. In addition to the household sector in the aggregate and the business sector, there's the government. And the government, of course, serves a very important function. There are services that would not have been provided if the government hadn't taken them over. National security or security within cities or security anywhere is a good example of such a function. But there are many other functions served by the government. The government provides services to people, and to finance these services, they have to get revenue from somewhere, much of it in the form of various types of taxes. The government is under a budget constraint. If the taxes fall short of the services paid for, governments can typically borrow in return for promising to pay back later. Now, what Prescott and I did in that paper was we thought of a simplified framework. You could think of it as a stylized framework. You could think of it as imagining that the government can formulate kind of a welfare function, a function that it wants to maximize, or I call it here an objective function. In the description of households, we describe preferences in the form of a utility function, and this utility function covers today and far into the future. Similarly, we could imagine the government's objective being such a function, representative of the people of the nation, and I'm going to assume that this function is unchanging, regardless of what government is in power. Let's imagine that we abstract from the fact that different governments might want to change the objective. And then you can simply think of that as an additional complication on top of what I'm about to tell you. So imagine the objective function of the government is unchanging. The government is subject to a budget constraint, just like you and me. Here's the theoretical result we discovered, and that is that optimal policy, the policy resulting from the government calculating what the outcome should be, the outcome maximizing that objective function over time, that optimal policy generally is inconsistent over time. And it implies, or it requires, a commitment mechanism in order for it to be implemented. If no such commitment mechanism exists, suppose the government succumbs to the inconsistency, then, as we showed through some graphic examples, one in the context of monetary policy, one in the context of fiscal policy, the outcomes can be very bad. What's a fundamental reason? Well, this optimal policy calculated by the government, if it does it right, it will take into account the effect this policy has on the behavior of the millions of people and the thousands of businesses far into the future. There are many such decisions by the government that play a role for people's decisions or businesses' decisions. An obvious example is investment behavior. You build a factory, you spend millions of dollars today, and the revenue comes in the form of, while you sell the resulting goods you produce, you sell them over maybe the next 10, 20, 30 years for as long as this so-called capital stock is productive. So this revenue is uncertain. Not only do you have to think about how productive the economy is going to be far into the future, but there's the additional source of uncertainty, and that is because what matters to you is, as an investor, is how much revenue or income do I get after the government has taken its share. That's really what matters. And so then you have to think about, what is that share? What is that tax rate that the government will apply to my income or to my revenue? So that's an example, but there are lots and lots of such examples, including also if you think rationally about the decision to accumulate more or less education, more or less human capital, the same kind of considerations can come into play. So you take that into account as in that optimal plan. Now let's fast forward, say 5 years. Suppose this, the economy has been chugging along, investments have been made, etc. The government sits down and they decide to recalculate this policy. Now, remember, the policy is already in effect. It's in effect for maybe another 5, 10, 20 years. If it's recalculated, you'll find a completely different policy. You may find that while at time zero I had promised a tax rate on capital income of 10%, now it seems optimal to say, oh, we might want to tax the next year's or the following year or the following couple of years the capital income at the rate of 50%, the thinking being that these factories will not be closed down. They will still, most of them will still continue to operate. It seems like a cheap way for the government to generate its revenue. Now, to counteract the effect that future investors will worry about these higher taxes, they might say, oh yes, and we'll reduce the taxes again back to the old level in 2 or 3 years. The end outcome is likely to be the higher tax rates than are optimal for the society. In the case of policy, what we showed in our example was the economy is likely to end up in higher inflation rates than is in the interest of society. So I already talked about the examples where the temptation is the greatest. The temptation could be to increase the tax on physical and human capital. It could be to partially renege on government debt through surprise inflation. That's something that's happened often in Latin America. debt was issued at a nominal interest rate, maybe in local currency, and then a hyperinflation hits, and the debt becomes essentially worthless to the holder of the debt. Meantime, from the point of view of the government, it's essentially costless to pay it back. It's costless in real terms. So all of this suggests that there is an incentive. From the point of view of society, it'd be nice if we had a mechanism to tie the government's hands so that this uncertainty about the future resulting from or coming from government behavior, that it's removed. In the case of monetary policy, these are three examples of such mechanisms that have been tried at various times. The gold standard dates back to mostly to the 19th century, and it lasted for a long time but fell apart in the finally in about 1930. The currency board, it's an interesting example because it was tried in Argentina, the example I like to use in my talk. Argentina, as you'll see graphically, fell on very hard times in the 1980s, so badly that that decade is often called the lost decade. There were hyperinflations. Someone told me, I had forgotten these numbers, but someone told me yesterday the inflation rate got up to 3,000% annually in 1989. Just an astounding number. But that's not the world record. Bolivia had even higher inflation rates in the 80s. So when Carlos Menem took over in about 1990, he figured he had to do something to increase the credibility of Argentina. And that's when he came upon the idea of a currency board to accumulate dollar reserves, promised that you will be willing to exchange the peso 1-for-1 with the dollar. That worked for a while, for about 8 years, and then it fell apart. My quick take on why it fell apart, a key reason was that, well, monetary policy cannot be viewed completely in isolation from fiscal policy, especially not in this case. And in the case of Argentina, what they did not solve was the fiscal situation. In Argentina, the provinces can borrow. They're not subject to a balanced budget requirement like the states, most of the states of the United States. They can borrow, and towards the end of the 1990s, it became clear that they would not be able to pay back their loans. They came running to the federal government, who bailed them out, and then the federal debt ballooned dramatically. And for whatever reasons, the government decided they could not hold the line, and then the peso is now, well, it takes about 3 pesos to buy $1. Now the mechanism that's more prevalent today is the idea of an independent central bank to try to isolate monetary policy as much as possible from political pressure by having a competent organization conduct monetary policy and try not to succumb to the pressure that will always fall on the central bank from politicians. And this has been used to various degrees in countries. Someone calculated an index of independence across nations on a scale from 1 to 5, and the correlation between the independence, the degree of independence, and the inflation environment being benign, it's very high. Countries have changed, in fact, over the past 10 or 20 years. Bank of England is an example where monetary policy was under the central government. the Bank of England was made independent in 1997. Scandinavian countries have become more independent. Argentina is an example where the central bank is absolutely not independent. There have been times when the head of the central bank, years when the head of the central bank was replaced half a dozen times in 1 year. Unbelievable. And it shows in the inflation experience of Argentina. So what many central banks, especially those that are fairly independent, do these days, they try to make their policy transparent. They make clear what their inflation target is, and they try to follow that target. That has worked pretty well, although one might say that they haven't really been put to the test because the business cycle environment has been quite benign since the early to mid-90s. We seem to be going into a rougher period now, and we'll see how well this works when they're really put to the test. This last point is a little subtle, and so in the interest of time, I think I'll skip it and instead invite you to come and talk to me about it afterwards. So let me talk about the main forces for economic growth. Inflation, the inflationary environment, I don't think is a major force. I mean, whether inflation is on the average 2% or 5%, it's not a big factor in economic growth. It's when the inflation rate really shoots up where growth can suffer. I think the main driving forces they are innovative activity and technological change, but that cannot be the only factor. There's got to be accumulation of productive ability to take advantage of the innovations, to take advantage of the research and development, to take advantage of what's being discovered. We need incentives to invest in this new capital, and that's where the government policy may be beneficial, or it could be detrimental to such growth. I'll give Argentina as an example where government policy has, in my mind, clearly been detrimental to long-run growth, and then I'll use Ireland as an example of the opposite. So here's a picture of what has happened in Argentina in the past 50 or 55 years. You saw the first picture, so you know that even over this period, in the early portion, it wasn't as if Argentina was growing that fast, but by the standard of the whole last 50 or 60 years, the first 30 years were pretty good. This, by the way, is in proportional scale, and so 1 centimeter increase up here is the same as same percent increase as a 1% centimeter increase down here. In 1980, a Great Depression ensued. GDP per working age person, which is what this chart is about, fell more than 20%, just an astounding drop in economic activity. Then, as you can see, the economy recovered during most of the 1990s, and then there was another drop from 1998 to about 2002 or 2003. This drop was just as large, if not larger, and it took place over a shorter period of time, over 5 years instead of 4 or 5 years instead of 10 years in the 1980s. Now, what can account for this big drop? There was a question, or these big drops, The question presented to a sometimes colleague, you heard that I sometimes consult, or I'm a research associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. One of the people with whom I work there is Carlos Sarsaga. He's originally Argentine, and we were asked to write the paper for a conference, write the paper about the 1980s. And we did, and we thought we came up with some interesting findings and so on. Now, we decided to go beyond that. And this was not for the conference, but simply for our own fun, almost. We had the data going well beyond 1990. We had the data for the all of 1990s and into the 2000s. We put the numbers into a standard business cycle model constructed on the assumption that everything would be working fine, constructed, calibrated to the Argentine economy, and we had a big surprise. The model said that in light of the productivity increases in Argentina, even in the 1990, when you saw, as you saw, it looked like Argentina grew pretty fast, it should have grown even faster. The capital stock should have been substantially larger at the end of the century. The decade. Here's an illustration of the contrast between the data in the model. Now, I'll point out that in the previous chart, everything was in terms of GDP per working age person. This is total GDP. So the drop in the 1980s, for example, will not show up as a big drop because at the same time there was also population increase. These are the data. The model says this is what should have happened to Argentina over this period. Following pretty well the data in the 80s, but in the 90s, the model said that Argentina should have grown substantially faster. I view that as almost like a thermometer. If you had looked at this in the 1990s, you would have said, there must be fever here. This patient doesn't have a temperature of 37. This patient has a temperature of maybe 39 or 40. This is a sign of potentially some disease. Even worse, if we look at the best measures of capital, the sum of all the factories and machines and office buildings, all the productive capacity of Argentina, here are the data. This is what the model said should have happened. Investments should have taken place much faster than it did in the 1990s. We take this as a sign that Argentina suffered from a disease. We call it the time inconsistency disease. The disease, I was trying to explain to you the fundamental reasons for it earlier. And the reason Argentina suffered from that disease had to do with their past behavior, not because of the way Carlos Menem behaved. He tried to do pretty well given the current situation, given the expectations that existed, but he could not overcome the memories of past hyperinflations, past devaluations, past deposit freezes, past defaults on government obligations. He could not overcome the resulting lack of credibility not just among investors in Argentina, but also among investors in other countries who might think about investing in Argentina. This is a very depressing picture for Argentina. When I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. This is the capital stock per working age person from 1980 until 2003. And as you can see, the peak was around 1981, 82. Since then, into 2003, I suppose I should have updated the numbers, but and I think they have turned around, but by 2003, 20 years later, the capital stock per working age person, per potential worker, the capital stock was 20% lower. Now, the economic implications of that are terrible. It means that it would predict that the real wages, the salaries of workers would be declining over time rather than increasing, as happens in most developed countries. The implications for the poor are likely to be particularly severe. In bad times, the people with higher human capital, the higher skills, they tend to do relatively okay. Not as well as if the capital stock had been higher, but they tend to do okay. The poor are the ones who really suffer. And the poverty levels in Argentina have risen steadily over this period. Can Argentina recover? It has recovered in the past 3 or 4 years, but it's not so clear yet that it has recovered for the duration. Argentina tends to focus a lot on the very short run. There's little discussion of what it takes for Argentina to grow in the long run. There's little focus on what policies are needed, what policy environment is needed for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And that's what it takes. Argentina will need to restore its confidence in economics. That's one of the things we know least about. We don't know so much about what it takes. Once you've lost confidence, once you've lost credibility, how can you recover it? It's not easy. Let me just spend the last 3 or 4 minutes, maybe, on some more general lessons for policy. I already mentioned the importance of incentives for productivity growth and capital accumulation. Government policy needs to be credible and forward-looking. And this is the good time to take the opposite example, namely that of the Celtic Tiger, Ireland. Ireland, I'm not saying that these are the only 2 factors behind Ireland's success, but they have to have been very important. One is Ireland had done relatively poorly for decades. Lots of their population had left for other countries, for the United States, for Britain, and so on. They had been losing many of their many of their best educated people. Ireland decided in around 1960 or in the 1960s to make secondary education free of charge. As a consequence, 20 years later, Ireland finds themselves with a potentially quite skillful workforce. By 1990, the education level among the population in Ireland was quite high. It's true they didn't have machines with which to put them to use, or the computers, or otherwise technological knowledge to put their potential skill to use.
We just heard Nobel laureate Kydland talking about peace and economic development in an event organized by the International Peace Foundation.
Thank you for joining us on the scene. Ricky Kydland was with us a while ago. Ricky, I guess, will have enough time to also explain some of his experiences covering the emergence of ZTE broadband witness Rodolfo June Losada in some of our shows later today. We'll see you again tomorrow. ANC will be covering the Senate's resumption of its inquiry on the ZTE broadband deal.
We leave you now with clips from the music video Yes We Can, featuring pop stars supporting U.S. presidential candidate Barack Obama.
It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
It was sung.
It was sung by immigrants. They struck out distant shores, pioneers, pushed westward against unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
It was the call of workers to organize, women who reached for the ballots, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier, and a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land. Yes, we can to justice and equality.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.